Versailles, 100 and still swinging. In many ways, this is a continuation of what I do with Versailles. If engineers were explaining an explosion to you, they would not say, well, it was about a match, which is what we do with the First World War. The First World War starts with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo and his wife Sophia, and all of the things that happened there. Because as academics, we want to put things in neat little boxes. We live in departments. We talk in platitudes about general occurrences, and we try to boil things down so they're simple to understand. Unfortunately, if you do that and we don't get down in the weeds far enough, you miss that lots of little facts add up to where we're going. Now, the social sciences generally are the tools we use to look at policy issues. History, I like to pick on my friends and my historian friends, history looks backwards. So it helps us understand what's happened before us. Sociology, we look outward. What are the organizations, the structures, the families, the groups that make up what we do? Psychology, we look inward. Why do we make decisions? What allows us to determine how we see the world, how we understand reality? The economists, they look at everything. The economists say that it's the only social science is really economics, the only science, and everything else is sociology. Well, that's their view. Now, policy, we ask why. Why did this happen, and what can we do to change it? What can we do about that? Well, the facts are in short here. There was an armistice at the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, and the fighting stops. We determine we're going to have a peace conference. That's at Versailles. That begins in January. On the 28th of June, we signed the Treaty of Versailles. That settles the peace between the Allies and Germany. On the 4th of June, 1920, we signed the Treaty of Trianon, which settles the war between the Allied powers and Hungary, and so on and so forth. We have various other treaties that solve these particular problems. Well, the tensions and the conflicts that led to the First World War did not start in Sarajevo in July of 1914. The tensions that led to the war didn't stop when January of 1919 comes around and we started Versailles. The reasons for the war were very complex. Now, I've been talking about World War I for 50, and Melanie, I have to correct you, unfortunately, and it's really sad. Unfortunately, it's 50 years instead of 40. You know, that resume was written some time ago, and but I don't look nearly that old. I was in diapers when I started, by the way, so that everyone knows that. I start off my lectures with the First World War, as I've been studying this for 50 years, and I cannot tell you succinctly why the war started. There are lots of reasons that give rise to the war. There are lots of forces. I have another lecture that I do called The Four Forces That Hold the World Together: the political balance, nationalism, tribalism, fundamentalism, globalism, and the balance of those forces in every country are what keeps the country in some kind of balance, some kind of equilibrium that allows countries to move forward. Well, all of those forces fell out of whack, if you will, in Europe, probably starting about 1871. But these are things that have taken hundreds or thousands of years to develop. It isn't just, we assassinate the emperor and we're trying to get goods and services cheaply from our colonies, and we're competing with armies and navies. There's a lot more going on than that. Well, the construct in which we can look at this, the situation at the end of the war, the tensions, the problems between nationalities, the problems between countries, the failings of empires. We lost the Habsburg Empire. We lost the Romanov Empire, of course, first, 1917. And right after the war, the Ottoman Empire disappears. And we started rearranging the power with the other countries. We don't talk about in Great Britain and the United States and France at Versailles with diminishing powers, but the powers were diminishing. We start in January with the Treaty of Versailles, with the Peace of Versailles, the conference, and we go all the way to the fall of 1920. So that 18 months roughly that we're looking at this problem as an alliance. During that 18 months, understand the United States, Great Britain, France, all were demobilizing. Australia wanted its troops back home. There were riots in the armies, the various armies, with troops who said the mobilization isn't happening fast enough. Well, if you have an armistice and you don't have a peace treaty yet, you are still in a formal state of war. In fact, about a year after the war, several divisions, 3 divisions went in to occupy Alsace and Lorraine from the French army. Marshal Foch marched a small army into Germany because things weren't settled. The reparations weren't being paid. Other issues that came up during the peace conference weren't being handled. And you needed those troops. Well, if you're demobilizing, if you think of an army being the extension of the power of the state, the extension of political power, that power, even though you've won the war, is diminishing. So what you can force an enemy to do until the peace treaty is signed, or if you're using your military forces to police the treaty, all of that is diminishing as the discussions are taking place. So you might think of our power, it's shrinking, from literally from the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, at which point the troops are, oh, the war is over, I can go home. That's how they're thinking. Not the politicians, not the generals. They still understand what's going on. The diplomats are now getting involved, and they are beginning to think about how we solve the problem. The troops want to go home. The people at home want their armies to go home. If you think about the enormous tax burdens on these various countries, the political climate is such that we want the economy to go back to normal. Let's start making industrial goods and consumer goods and do all of those things that we like to do in peacetime. Well, the construct we're in, most of the Central Powers were looking at settling the war because they were broke. We had fought, that we had bled ourselves dry. We had spent ourselves dry, bled ourselves dry. Our navies had been diminished and this is both sides. So what was it that we were thinking that we would use to solve this problem? What is the construct the Central Powers have, the Allies have? And Wilson's 14 points, I'm going to enumerate though, because it's very important. This is why the Bulgarians surrendered early. This is why the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl, why he abdicated. And of course, this is the political argument being made inside of the German Reich, which ultimately forces the Kaiser to abdicate, and a German republic is declared. Well, the first of Wilson's 14 points, about which I would point out that I believe it was Clemenceau who said God only needed 10 commandments, Wilson needed 14. That may give you an idea of what the Allies thought of the problem and the solution Wilson was bringing up. The first point is that diplomacy should be public. Diplomacy before the war, and even during, if you think of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which settled between France and Britain how they would deal with the Middle East at the end of the war, that was secret. We didn't know about that at the time. We learned about that afterwards. So secret agreements had in many ways been a cause of the war from President Wilson's point of view. Now, Wilson does say fairly often leading up to the war. He doesn't say this quite as much, probably because his wife Edith and Colonel House told him not to say it publicly. I'm not an expert in foreign affairs. I don't know anything about other nations. He was a domestic politician, a lawyer, a PhD in political science. He worried about the economic order of policy, how to make his own country better, that was where he concentrated. He had a thesis as a young man. He wrote 9 books. He had a thesis as a young man where he talks about the need for restructuring America. He wanted a more parliamentary system that put, as he saw it, more balance. Those are the kinds of things he thought about, not really international affairs. But his second point, freedom of the seas. Certainly with the conflict between, original conflict between colonial nations, freedom of the seas, where you could go, who you could trade with, and of course, unlimited trade, which I'll get to at another point. These are things Wilson saw as being extremely important, and certainly the Central Powers viewed that as the world they wanted to be in after the war was over. Free trade, the same issue, that no trade barriers, you're able to trade. Small nations would not have to be under the aggrandizement of larger nations. They could individually participate in the international system and expect to be treated fairly. Arms limitations, which there was a huge arms race before the war. One of the reasons historians will give us for the war is this competition between the land powers in continental Europe, and with the advent of their colonies bringing additional power to bear. And of course, the Kaiser starting right after the turn of the century to begin to build up a navy, realizing that what he did not have in terms of addressing Great Britain was that he did not have naval power that would enable him to freely send out the German merchant marine, go where they wanted to go. As he saw it, the seas of the world were policed by the British Navy, and he didn't like that. He saw Germany as being hemmed in. They're constricted between Russia and France on land, and then they're constricted by the advent of British naval power at sea. Britain, of course, having the largest fleet at the time. In 1921, there was the famous disarmament conference in Washington, where because battleships, dreadnoughts, were the ultimate weapon at the time. That was the nuclear weapon of 1914, the dreadnought battleships. And a scheme was worked out. We call it Rolls-Royce, Ford, so that the United States and England would be equal in terms of the ships. 5 battleships, 3 to the French, no battleships, and of course no submarines to the Germans. So we tried to work this out around the world. The Japanese representative at the time in 1921 was a young lieutenant commander who had been injured in the Battle of the Tsushima Straits, and he was a famous poker player around Washington during the conference. He had lost 2 fingers. He was a gunnery officer. He'd lost 2 fingers at the Tsushima Strait. So whenever this young commander walked into a bar where they knew him and he drank rye and asked what he wanted, he would put up the 3 fingers he had left and say 3 fingers. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, by the way. So we had this carry-on of people who were involved, that the names keep coming up, Churchill, Ho Chi Minh is there, Du Bois is at Versailles, all of those things that are being considered in the guise of these 14 points. Number 5, impartial rulings on colonial claims. Wilson wanted to end colonialism. America's point, and I'll talk about this a little later, that people come to the conference with attitudes. They've got things to do. They've got an agenda. So you don't arrive at a conference, a peace conference after 4 years of war, unless there's something you want. What do you want to get out of this? So clearly, colonial, the breakup of these colonial empires was something Wilson wanted. He didn't get that. And in fact, many of the arguments, John Maynard Keynes, who was the economic advisor to David Lloyd George, leaves. He goes home because he's not happy with what happens, and he writes all sorts of criticism of the various parties, what we call the Big Four. Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Victoria Orlando from Italy. What we call the Big Four, he doesn't quite see them as being so big. He calls them little men. He refers to Wilson as a booby. He refers to Clemenceau as the great ape. He's not happy with who these people are and what they want. He sees them as being very, very petty. Sixth, restore Russian territories. Of course, there is the civil war in Russia has already started. You know, they've been fighting for a while, and we might show at this point, Melanie, if you will, we could put up the map of Europe before the war, so to give folks an idea of what Europe looked like at the very beginning, and we can look at that for a moment as I'm talking about these points, because this is the old Europe that gets into the struggle, that gets into the fight. This is what people are defending in terms of national boundaries when the war starts. Europe will look during the war, and of course, very different afterwards. A restoration of Belgian independence, it's the seventh point Wilson makes. Eighth is Alsace and Lorraine will be restored to France. 9, we will redraw Italian boundaries respecting ethnicity. If you remember, Italy came into the war late. They are essentially fighting the Austro-Hungarian Empire over local issues. If we think of the Irrident, that part of Italy that now goes over into the top of the Balkans, east of Venice, we must remember that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That particular area, Giuseppe Green, Giuseppe Verdi is from that area. He writes his first operas in German because he's a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So his name was Josef Grün. He was a German speaker because that was the national language of the country in which he was born. Although he is Italian by birth, by cultural inclinations, and so forth. So there were millions of people who were on the wrong side of borders in terms of their cultural nexity. They were outside of what they saw as their own country. We have the word that comes up from that time, an irredentus, a person who wants his country restored to where it's supposed to be, to the larger ethnic grouping in which it was a part. The people of Austria would be, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, would be allowed self-determination. So the various ethnic groups, there were 13 versions of the national anthem in Austria. 13 different languages in Austria-Hungary. So you sang the national anthem in your own language. So this was a very disparate empire in terms of what it did. We think of Germany today as a country. We can put the map down, Melanie, thank you. We think of it as a country, but Germany was a fairly new land in terms of talking about Germany. Grammatically, it would be correct to talk about Germany at the turn of the century as the Germanies. So the Kaiser's title, he was Kaiser of the Germanies. Prussia, Brandenburg had put together this coalition. The Franco-Prussian War starts in 1871. At the end of the war, the Kaiser is declared the emperor of all of the Germanies, and participating at his crowning at Versailles were the Duke of Baden-Württemberg, the King of Bavaria, and all the various other potentates in the German states, which before Napoleon had been 300. Napoleon reduces them to 30, and Frederick the Third makes this he makes this an empire in 1871 after France is conquered. So you go into another country, you invade another country to solidify your own nationality. I mean, would that make sense to us now? That would be like President Trump attacking Canada. I hope there are no Canadians here as I use this example. President Trump attacks Canada and then declares himself king of the United States because he's conquered the Canadians. Now, of course, Canadians, being very polite, would probably just say sorry if we did that, but hopefully that doesn't happen. But think how strange that would be. Italy, of course, in 1861 had become a country. The various Italian states had come together. So we had these disparate empires, Austria-Hungary, that becomes 14 countries when the war is over. We have the Germany, which loses some territory out at its edges, not a great deal, but some territory. And we can In fact, Melanie, if we could put up the map of 1925 at this point, that might be useful. So we have Germany losing territory. We have Hungary, which had been a kingdom, a separate kingdom within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph was the emperor, the Kaiser of Austria-Hungary, but he was also separately the king of Hungary. So that was a separate royal status that the Habsburg family had. Well, when the war is over, Europe looks very different. Hungary loses about 2/3 of its territory and 40% or so of its population. So there are Hungarian-speaking people in these new countries. They're in Slovenia, they're in Czechoslovakia, there's some Hungarians in what became Italy, and of course, Romania gets a good bit of Hungary as well. So we've got these new lands that are created out of these old empires, but we still have these same ethnic groupings. The 11th point is self-determination, and that was particularly focused at the Balkan states, where Yugoslavia, of course, is created. So at the time, that would be called the kingdoms of the Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. So that was these three major ethnic groups, although there were others present, of course, that formed this new kingdom under the Serbian royal family, the Karađorđević family. So we create Yugoslavia essentially out of whole cloth to try to get at this self-determination issue. Thank you, Melanie. The independent Poland should be established, and it should have access to the sea. So if we think of East and West Prussia that dominate the Baltic on top, north of the Polish state, the traditional Polish state, that of course prevents Poland from being economically independent. They need access to the seas. East Prussia is taken away. If you think about our own times, the Danzig corridor, if you're Polish, it's Gdansk. If you're German, it's Danzig. You don't take the ethnic groups and throw them away. You merely put different labels on the land, but you still have tensions inside. That clearly hasn't gone away. And finally, the 14th point was there should be an international associations to resolve problems, what became the League of Nations. So that was the guise over which this all happens. Well, Churchill, when he arrives at the conference and begins to deal with a lot of these problems, and it's his pencil in many cases that helps draw the map. He's a dominant force, although he is the minister for colonies. He's a dominant force. He was very close to Lloyd George. He says, after things become very difficult, and it's clear they're not going to resolve things as easily, as quickly as they would like, that the war of the giants is over and the war of the pygmies begin. So that's how he looks at the conference. Now, I was thinking, some years later, after El Alamein, he gives a famous speech, and that might have been adequate to describe what he saw at the time. I believe it went something like, this is not the end, nor is it the beginning of the end, but perhaps it is the end of the beginning. Well, where we were, where the great states were in 1918, looking at ending the war, ended the fighting between these large states. But all of these tensions, and we might think of two major forces that the peace negotiators had to deal with at this point. One would be ethnic nationalism, because of these last 3 points that Wilson has made. Ethnic nationalism, as understood with the concept of self-determination, that was coming out. You had taken these old empires, this huge Habsburg empire that went down into the present-day Ukraine, Lviv, at the far west of the Ukraine. That was an Austrian city. In Poland, the southern part of Poland was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ruthians in present-day Hungary, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then, of course, the Austrians, the Hungarians, and their empire was pushing south. What starts the war, essentially, their tensions with the Serbs, with the Croats, with the Slovenes, which groups were integrated well into their empire, which weren't. The Austrians today say that, I lived in Austria for a while, the Austrians today say the Slovenes are Austrians who speak another language. And you spend time in Slovenia, it's very much like Austria. The customs and traditions are very much the same, although they speak a Slavic language. The regiments in the army around these 13 major groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were all stationed in different parts of the empire, not related to their own ethnic base. So a Polish regiment would be, for example, in Austria, a Hungarian regiment would be in Slovenia or in the upper part of Hungary. But in Slovenia, Slovene regiments, there were 4 major regiments, one that covered each of the 4 passes into Austria, the 4 mountain passes. Those are all Slovene regiments. That didn't exist anywhere else in their empire because they felt the loyalty of Slovenia was so strong that they didn't have to worry about the ethnic tension of the imperial family being put together. It's sort of like, I used to say in the army, I see Dave out there, Dave will remember this, I don't like Americans who are hyphenated. Because if I've got to go up a hill and I say, well, you know, we're fighting these people today, I don't want to look back and have someone say, well, you know, I'm a slice whatever is American, and I want, which side are you on? Are you behind me or are you with the guys on the top of the hill? So you can imagine in the Austro-Hungarian army, they had that problem in spades, if you will. It was a very difficult kind of situation to deal with. Well, where are we fighting? Where are we fighting? What's going on here? We've got in a Russian Civil War, 1919 to 1922. We've got and that's very serious. This essentially is at the very top of this. If we look at it in large measure, it is the whites versus the reds. The whites are the Tsarist forces, and they are in various places. They are particularly strong down near the Black Sea, with the center of their forces being the Cossacks, who had been very loyal to the Tsar. That's a tradition that goes back quite some ways. Odman Kamenetsky is a Ukrainian patriot in the 1660s who negotiates with the Russians, thinks that he is signing a defense pact, what the Russians think is that he's joined the Russian Empire. So it's, you know, the languages are pretty close. It just depends on how you look at the situation. Well, he comes into the empire with the Cossacks, loyal to the Tsar, and that continues on for the next 250 years or so. So in 1907, the Romanovs celebrate 300 years of success of their family being the ruling family within Russia. Well, once again, we have this empire where if you just listen to the name, Tsar of all of the Russias. So all of those various ethnic groups that go, and remember, Russia covers 11 time zones. So all of those various groups, they are considered Russias, individual Russian sanctioned states. And those come together collectively underneath the Tsar. So the Kaiser is Kaiser of the Germanys, the Tsar is Tsar of all the Russias. These are very different people from various places. Well, as the war breaks out, people are fighting to protect these large empires, but they're not only protecting the imperial construct, they are protecting the piece of the construct that represents their ethnicity. So Ruthenians are fighting in the Austro-Hungarian armies, but Ruthenia is what they're fighting so that Ruthenia is well defended. The Magyars of Hungary are fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they are defending the sanctity, the freedom, the structure of Hungary. the various ethnic groups. And at the end of the war, if we think about these maps, and I mentioned that 40% of Hungarian land is lost, some of that land is lost to Austria. So Burgenland, which is at the very far east of Austria, and by the way, if you live in Vienna, every morning you get the weather from all over Austria. It's a fairly small country. And I remember listening to the English language station. I'm getting dressed to go to work in the morning at the UN. I would get the weather for Burgenland. And I wonder, why are they making, and it was very close. Maybe it's 1 degree difference Celsius, and it's raining in Vienna. It's always raining in Vienna. And it's slightly drizzling in Burgenland. Burgenland is 10 miles away. It's not very far. It was that part of Hungary given over to Austria, the new Republic of Austria, created by the abdication of Karl, to so that a Republic of Austria would be able to negotiate with the Allies. Then now we have, okay, the Civil War is going on now at the in the north of Russia, and we might think of Bolshevik Russia from 1917 until 1918 for a year or so, and particularly after Brest-Litovsk is signed, as Russia is completely surrounded by the war. They're completely surrounded by the war. There is war in the Middle East. The British, of course, are in the Middle East and fighting. We think of war on the Western Front. The war on the Eastern Front was about 70% of the size of the war on the Western Front. So we have a front in the east from the Atlantic Ocean and Belgium, Netherlands border, going all the way south and through France, through Belgium, through France, all the way south to the Swiss border. So we know about that. We read about that. We study that. We think of that as the war. Well, there's also war from the Baltics all the way down to the Adriatic. There's this war on the Eastern Front. What makes Hindenburg and Ludendorff famous is that the Germans saw that as the weak back door. That was the front they had to worry about. German strategists, von Falkenhayn, General von Falkenhayn, General von Roon before him, and von Moltke the Elder in 1871, followed the advice of Frederick the Great. You don't fight a two-front war. That is the German strategic problem from the 17th century to the middle of our century, the middle of our last century, until 1945. That was the German problem, not how not to fight a two-front war, what you need to do for your political gains. And the answer was, you fight one, win decisively, then you turn and fight the other. So this was the plan of the younger von Moltke. When the war starts, von Falkenhayn, when he takes over as chief of staff of the German army, and he has all of these ethnic group issues that had to be dealt with. Where can we find allies that we can work with? What can the German Empire promise? The Austro-Hungarian part, the southern part of this area to the east, where are they strong and have good ethnic support of the various areas? And where are they going to have to bolster this up with lots of German troops? So if we think of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that Lenin and Trotsky signed, Russia is able to stabilize their frontier. So they've got this war that they're fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and now that war stops. Well, there is a civil war going on. They haven't conquered all of Russia, and they're busy trying to do that. They've got these white forces, the Tsar's forces, that are fighting the Red Army in the Baltics. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania are trying to defend against this Bolshevik incursion coming north. They're trying to defend against a German incursion coming east. They are busy fighting two wars at the same time. The Bolsheviks are fighting these peripheral wars around the edge, trying to defend the structural integrity of Western Russia, but they haven't conquered the east. Siberia is not within their orbit. For example, the Black Sea area is not within their orbit. The Ukraine declares itself an independent country. So now they're fighting the Ukraine, which had been integrated, as I mentioned, 1665, Komolensky. So that's been a long time with all of the tensions that were there. The northern part of the northwestern part of the Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there are connections in that part of the Ukraine. The old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as the Polish spirit of independence begins to rise, the Poles want to free themselves of being, if you remember Nicholas, titles again. Nicholas is Tsar of all the Russias. He's also Grand Duke of Finland, and he's King of Poland. He is all of those things. Well, the Poles want their own country. They want to be free of the Russians. So there is a Russo-Polish War that goes on from 1919 until 1922. Marshal Pilsudski acquits himself quite well on the field. He's got 3 armies that are fighting the Bolsheviks at one time, as the Soviet Union now wants to get back this old Tsarist imperial territory, and the Poles are able to defend themselves quite well. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians don't do quite as well, and the Poles, after they do well against the Soviets, they drive south and try to take the Ukraine. So for some of the end of this period, there is a Polish-Ukrainian war. We don't talk about it formally, but there's a war between Poland and the Ukraine. Part of the Ukraine is occupied by Poland. Some of the troops, these Polish troops that are occupying the Ukraine, had been Austro-Hungarian troops in the Austro-Hungarian part of Poland that had previously served time in the Ukraine. That had been their country when we think of Austria-Hungary as this band across Central Europe, central in terms of East and West, but also central in terms of North-South. So that's going on. Those people are fighting. Then, of course, at the instigation of France, at the very end of the war, at the instigation of France, the Ottoman Empire is coming apart. France pushes Greece to invade Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, as it's falling, and says that you should have some of the territory that you've lost. Well, now the Greek point of view at this time is that certainly all of Thrace is theirs, and they feel that some of the land around the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles ought to be theirs too. If you look back historically at, thank you, Emily. If you look back historically at the Greek Empire, the Greek world, classically, all of what we think of as Roman, the Greeks looked upon as that had been theirs before. They want some of that back as well. So you can imagine how difficult that would be. Well, that's 45 minutes. I had 3 cards here, three cards. I guess we've covered the 3 cards. That's 45 minutes. Why don't I open this up for some questions? I suspect I've created enough consternation out there that you've got questions, disagreements, comments, complaints, whatever. I will try to handle that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Really quickly, did you want me to show the Brest-Litovsk treaty map as well, or maybe we can show that in addressing a question?
Well, we can put it up if a question comes up.
Okay, sounds good.
I've probably thrown up 2 minutes.
So let me just get organized here.
And I apologize, that was so quick and so much thrown in, but they only give me an hour. This is probably a 6-week course. Then I could do more of the 3 cards. There's not much here.
No, that's a lot. That's a lot of info. That I know I have learned a lot for sure. So let me just get on my other screen here. Okay, so for the questions, everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. If you do want to see the meeting as a whole, you can switch to gallery view if you want to do that, or you can leave it on speaker view, whatever you choose. If you could just speak up, if you do have a question, unmute yourself and speak up, because we do have about 75 people on here, which is great. And so you're spread out across multiple screens for me. I'll try to scan the different screens as far as possible, but the best thing is for you just to unmute yourself and speak up. And if we have multiple people who want to speak at once, then I'll sort that out. I do see some questions coming in on the chat, so I'll start to collect those. But again, you can just, you don't need to put your question in the chat. You can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I'll start off. Richard Vandenbril here. I don't have a question, but I'm half Ukrainian. My mother's parents came from Austria, Hungary, and Galicia. I never heard the term Ruthene until I joined this group. We were Ukrainians. Anyway, my mother's father said that he really, the empire really had a lot of good things going for it. You know, people, you could go anywhere around the empire and hitchhike, which he did as a young man. You want to sleep in a farmer's barn at night, you just go ask him, can I sleep in your barn? Sure. You know, the empire had been at peace for 100 years since Napoleon. So, and the people for the most part got along. They had ethnic conflicts, which one of the reasons he left in 1910 is he didn't like the politics. And of course, they're on the border with Russia and they got run over by the Russians when the war started. But anyway, I've been doing a lot of study on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On YouTube, there's actually a group. It's almost nostalgic. You know, there's kind of a sense that, you know, maybe it wasn't so bad after all, given what happened afterwards with World War I and World War II. I mean, you know, the Habsburgs had ruled since the 1200s and saved really Europe from the Ottoman Empire twice. I mean, 1684, I think, was the last time. So at any rate, and then people did well in the empire. So anyway, those are just my observations. And I really love this talk because, of course, we're all passionate about World War I, before, afterward, its aftermath, and so on. So thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you for the comment. I would agree with everything you've said. There were certainly lots of people in various groups that were loyal to the empire because it brought peace and stability. If you think about the Habsburg family, you mentioned since the 1200s, Otto Habsburg was a count in what's today Switzerland. And the family expands to the east in the next 700 years. And they expand by conquering small areas, adding to their own, the county, to the dukedom, and then eventually they become kings and emperors because they bring in these smaller areas. They're disparate. They don't fit into with the other people around them. I see a question from Professor Martinez in writing a few moments ago about the Tyrolean Valley and Italians there and why Austria got the Tyrol. Well, the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, added smaller areas continuously over 600 years because they did bring stability. Now, the stability comes with force, and there are going to be some changes to the monetary power, to the political power. And of course, they opened up, religion was accepted. So whatever religion you were, as long as you paid your taxes to the empire, the Roman Empire, right? You render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God's. So the Habsburgs tried to do that in many ways. Now, it helped if you spoke German. It didn't hurt to speak German, no matter what, if you were Polish, if you were Ukrainian, if you were Ruthenian, if you were Albanian, it helped if you spoke German. That was useful in terms, that was the lingua franca of the empire. But people had eventually, in the 19th century, had individual parliaments. So Poland had its own parliament. Hungary had its own parliament. They could deal with internal matters, not foreign affairs or defense. That was all done in Vienna. But the empire had lots of good things to recommend it. And I think in many ways, an Austro-Hungarian empire, dare I say this now as an American and a good Democrat, but it had many good things by bringing people together from these desperate areas. They were economically better integrated. It allowed for growth and expansion over that period of 600 years, 700 years. So I would agree with you. Wasn't perfect, but it had some good things about it. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Why not give Constantinople back to Greece if they're restoring some Greek territories out of the Ottoman Empire?
Now, are you asking that question today, or is that a 1918 question?
1918, 1919.
1918 question. Well, I did not concentrate the talk on what we need now is a map of the Ottoman Empire. It covers North Africa. It goes as far east as Armenia and Georgia. It goes up to the Russian border in the southern Caucasus. This was a huge empire. That empire had since 1453, the fall of Constantinople and the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. That had been an Ottoman, under the purview of the Ottomans. So you've now got 600 years from 1914 until 1456 until 1920, you've got this Ottoman Empire that's there. Greeks had more or less spent their time in the latter part of that, the last 250 years, on the continent of Europe. They were away from Constantinople in large measure. The Turkish population had grown larger, and of course, Constantinople was the imperial capital of a very large empire that once again had lots of different ethnic groups. There were Arabs in this group. There were, all the way, this went all the way to Morocco. This is a long way, Algerians. At one point, you had Spanish subjects of the empire, and of course, the empire went up all through the Balkans. Not only Greece, but other parts of the Balkans, parts of Serbia, Montenegro, Albania were all parts of that empire. So when you say give Constantinople back to the Greeks, would that make any sense in terms of self-determination and the ethnic groups that live there? So just creating a modern Turkey was hard enough without cutting it up and giving their capital off to the Greeks, who were people from the West as they viewed them. And does that answer the question? It just wouldn't make sense given the people who lived there at the time. I mean, how far back do we go when we're going to look at the history? So do we give the Potawatomi? Do we give them Washington? That would be the equivalent question in North America. Would that make any sense in terms of 330 million people in 2020, almost 2021, who are now in a place that used to be occupied by indigenous people who have been far outnumbered with a new political reality? Other questions?
I have a question. I have a question if I have.
Yes,
Can
sir.
I say
Who
it?
am I talking to?
All right. My question is this, is the current map of the Middle East is also a result of the British and French after
Yes.
World War I and creating countries. I have a feeling where our involvement there is more or less an extension of what happened in 1918, 1919 at Versailles. My point is there any chance of any resolution in the Middle East for whatever has happened because of what happened in 1918, 1919?
Sal, that's a great question. That's a fantastic, it's fantastically complicated. Now, I could play with the pieces of that. Churchill creates Transjordan and Iraq. We take their four large families, important families in what we would call Saudi Arabia. And those families were given kingdoms and princedoms to rule at the end of the war, as long as they work within a semi-colonial framework. And that's what we've inherited. So the kingdom of Transjordan, it's now a little bit smaller, but Jordan is pretty much the way it was. The Hashemite family got the kingdom, they kept it. The Hashemites also got Iraq, and they kept that for about 40 years or so. Unfortunately, that fell apart. It's taken over by a dictatorship. Eventually, Saddam Hussein, after 3 dictators before him, becomes a successor and interests there.
Where are my pants?
People were put together by tribal groups. So if you were a sociologist and you looked at Iraq, you would see Erbil, you would see Mosul, and you would see Baghdad as major tribal ethnic groups and their centers of power. That was put together and created for the convenience of the British because they wanted to protect the Suez Canal. So you needed relationships, if not colonies, you needed subservient relationships with particular countries so that your interest in getting to India, which the Jews let Lebanon out of this as part of their deal, that's Sykes-Picot. And you're right in the sense that the successor states there have relationships either with Britain or with the allies of the First World War. And by the way, Wilson thinks after things go his way at Versailles, Wilson uses the term about us that we are associates because he wanted to back away from some of the things the Allies were doing, particularly in terms of protecting their colonial empire. So many of these states, in fact, all of the states in North Africa and the Middle East are artificial, except for Egypt, in the sense that these are places where former colonial powers put together nation states. And a lot of this is Mr. Churchill, who helped draw some of these maps. We put them together with the interest of the great powers rather than the interest of self-determination with the local people. And we're dealing with instability and unrest because these are states that have not naturally formed over a long period of time of people interacting and deciding, my four forces, nationalism, that we're better off if we've come together with other people who are a little different, but we can create a nation state that'll make some sense. Much like the 13 colonies had to come together to fight the British to free themselves, but people were very different, different points of view, different topography, different economic, and that happened as a natural function. And 80 years later, there was a civil war. You know, it wasn't perfect here by any means. And this was mostly English and German speaking people. So I guess the answer is no. That was a long-winded way of saying, no, we're not liable to see peace come quickly. The diplomats we send, the military people that we send, I was struck when President Biden announced General Lloyd Austin as his pick for a defense secretary. And he says he was in charge of, Biden was in charge of President Obama's team to reduce our forces in Iraq. And General Austin was the CENTCOM commander who went over, and Biden says he sat at a table and he listened to General Austin, and he said he was staring at him in uniform thinking that is this guy in the Defense Department, is he a soldier or is he a diplomat, when he listened how he talked and dealt with these ethnic tensions of various groups and all of the local problems that were there. Well, that's that soldier statesman that we started developing in World War II, Marshall being the premier example, that it isn't fighting the war and winning, it's understanding what you've got, the pieces afterwards, and how do you put them back together in a way that makes some sense for those people. That's why Austin is being considered. That's the kind of people we're going to have in our diplomatic and in our defense establishment to deal with that, because we have inherited these problems that the British couldn't solve. They weren't smart enough. You know, Don Maynard Keynes says little men. I don't know if it's little men. Keynes is certainly brilliant. Keynes is certainly brilliant. Maybe it's the problems were too big, that they couldn't be solved with an 18-month conference where old empires were either trying to protect what little they had left if they were destroyed, or protect their colonial empires in a world that was changing.
Well, thank you very much on this, Professor.
Yes,
you certainly make it a big quantity to swallow, but I thank you for it because you've done a great job.
You only gave me an hour.
Yeah, I guess we have time. Well, should we take one more question, Jim? And I can also, for those of you who we didn't get to your questions, I can.
People can email me the questions, and I'll certainly try to deal with them later after the meeting's over.
Yeah, I can.
I have a quick question.
And I can stay on as long as you want. I mean, you want to end the meeting, but I can stay on if you like.
Well, we do have a couple of questions here that have been in the chat for a couple of minutes. So let's take one more of those. So kind of a question related to some of what we've been talking about. What was President Wilson's attitude to the demands of the various European ethnic groups for their own country? Did he have a consistent official policy on this?
Well, Wilson starts off with, he writes the 14 points. And many people, I think when you study this, I can remember, high school, I thought the 14 points were this general effusive statement of human rights, of self-determination being the principal example, that we want to make the world safe for democracy kind of thinking, which is what his mantra coming into the war. Well, he arrives, and to great fanfare, by the way. He's greeted when he gets to Paris with this wonderful victory parade that's just for him. The Allies treat him with great deference because we came in at the end of the war with fresh troops. We had 1 million men in the fight. We had another 1 million men there ready to go. The next year, we had a 3rd million in the United States. So considering that the Allies were exhausted, our role was very important, and it was considered important by the Allies in terms of the fight. But think about this. I love economists. Economists have lots of wonderful expressions. They measure things. They have something they call readjustment and correction. So when you lose your job because they don't make buggy whips anymore, and you've got to figure out how to make something else, that's a correction. Now, I would say that's a depression because I'm out of work and my skill as a buggy whip maker is no longer needed because everybody's driving cars. So I need to figure out how to melt rubber onto wagon wheels so that early cars can use them. I'm in trouble. Well, what happens with this readjustment or correction is that you have to look at what all of the forces do to a nation state. In 1914, the United States was a debtor nation. We owed $4 billion to our European trading partners. In 1920, when the war has been over for a year, Europe owes us $10 billion. So that is a $14 billion difference. And now remember, that doesn't sound like big money to you. Remember Everett Dirksen, a few billion here, a few billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. 1901 was the first year that the regular budget, non-wartime, of the United States reached $1 billion. This was a great deal of money. So 14 billion difference, 4 billion in the negative column, 10 billion in the positive column at the end. The Europeans knew that if they were going to pay back that debt, they had to get certain things. So the French needed money from the Germans. They needed reparations from the Germans to pay us our debt. The British needed money. The British didn't finish paying for World War I until 1985. They didn't finish for paying for World War II until 2015. So the money that we loaned our allies during the war was tremendous. They had to get that back. Italy came into the war late because they wanted the Trio. They wanted the Irrident. They wanted where Maximilian's wife comes from, this area that's to the immediate east of Venice. They wanted to bring that into their empire. So countries had their own reasons. France wanted security and protection. They wanted Alsace-Lorraine, but they also wanted a demilitarized zone. That area in the map that we looked at, that where the German Empire expanded and the Austro-Hungarian Empire expanded after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that area was considered by the Allies at Versailles a cordon sanitaire. So we needed a group of states that were set up, Poland being the principal one, but Czechoslovakia and Hungary, as these are areas that protect us from this expanding Bolshevik revolution from the East, and of course, would bring some sort of structural balance in an economic and a political sense in the center of Europe to replace the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the point that Richard made about the stability that existed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, how do you restore that? You bring in smaller nations that make good economic units. If you think about Yugoslavia and all of the problems, not only before the war with the Karađorđević regime, but after the war with Tito, these are a multiple set of nation states that these are people who had not gotten along with each other in history ever. that were suddenly put together. And what we were trying to do is make a stable nation that was that made economic sense. They were economically sound, and that they could have some political connections that would work. And does that answer the question? So Wilson's, he's not happy at the end. He's now got to fight with these colonial powers that want their empires back. And what happened to my 14
Yes,
points?
thank you.
Thanks.
Along with this, why are they so difficult to deal with? He's unhappy. He goes from being a very happy, triumphant warrior king to a frustrated diplomat who's not getting other people around him to make sense. By the way, Keynes called that he's fooled by all these people. He's a booby. That's the term Keynes uses. Princeton professors are not usually called boobies, then or now.
Thanks, Jim. So sorry, everyone, we are going to have to wrap it up. If you do have a question that you didn't get to ask and you wanted to send, okay. Somebody started sharing their screen.
Melanie, I have something to say.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Sal. Let me just put the email address up again. And so I've put here we do have several videos on YouTube of these meetings that we've recorded over the past several months. So you can see them all at the link I just sent. You can also Google World War I HA YouTube. Here again is Jim's address. So if you have any further questions, you can send them to him. And I've also saved the chat, and I'll send any remaining questions to him for you. And so Sal, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks. Go ahead.
All right, just two things. Is just that the next meeting will be on the 16th of January in 2021, and I will make a presentation then. And then the second thing is that I want people to renew their membership with the Great War Society, the World War I Historical Association. So please, everybody who wants to be, come on, join us again. And special thanks to Dr. Armstead for doing a splendid job, as he always does.
Thank you, Sal. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in January.
Thank you.